Good evening. On behalf of the Anis Makdisi Program in Literature, I welcome you all. We have with us our distinguished guest, Professor Charles Butterworth, and we are really privileged to receive his talk on Al-Farabi's Art of Lawgiving. Professor Butterworth is an authority in classical Islamic thought and political philosophy. He's an eminent professor at the University of Maryland. His publications have ranged over a whole spectrum of studies in this domain, including the establishment of critical editions of most of the middle commentaries written by Ibn Rushd on Aristotle's logic, and the translations of books by Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi, Al-Razi, and Musa ibn Maymun. Professor Butterworth is a senior member and past president of the American Council for the Study of Islamic Societies and the Société Internationale d'Histoire des Sciences et des Philosophies Arabes et Islamiques, which has its secretariat based at the CNRS in Paris. Before joining the University of Maryland, he taught at the University of Chicago, at Georgetown, Harvard, in addition to Marmara University, Université de Bordeaux, Grenoble, Paris 1 Sorbonne, Paris 10 Nanterre, École Pratique, and other institutions. He was also principal investigator for the prestigious Smithsonian Project in Medieval Logic, particularly based in Cairo. And he also led various projects that were sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US, focusing on Arabic logic. It gives us great pleasure to have him here with us, and please extend a warm welcome to him.
Thanks very much. It's indeed a great pleasure to be here at AUB and in Beirut. It's a delightful place to come to, and the intellectual current that one feels here at the university is always challenging. I hope I can live up to that challenge. The remarks that I want to share with you tonight are based on an edition and translation of Al-Farabi's summary of Plato's laws, Jama' Nawamis Aflatun. This work, I'll go into the details about it. It's a fascinating little work, and I have learned a great deal as I've been working through them. The title of the talk ought to give you pause. Al-Farabi as a lawgiver? What's going on? And it's that play on words and on ideas that I'd like to share with you. I'll raise a number of different points and try to address them. And the first point is really the puzzling issue of our thinking about politics and thinking about what we as human beings do with respect to politics. If we need laws to live together in harmony, how does the first human being fathom the political good and the steps leading to it? Now, I've said that this is Al-Farabi's summary of Plato's laws. I'll come to an issue in a moment about whether it really is a summary of Plato's laws or a summary of something else or something else entirely. But for the moment, bear with me while I think along the lines that it is linked to Plato's laws. It's linked to Plato's laws in a remarkable way. It has nothing whatever to do with the dialogical structure of the laws. As you know, if you've read the laws, there is an Athenian stranger, a man by the name of Megillus, and a man by the name of Cleinias. All three are of a certain advanced age. they meet on the island of Crete, and they begin to walk from this point where they've all met up the long road to the cave where Zeus gave Rhadamanthus the laws that govern Crete. And they decide that they'll talk about what happened as they go along. That much of the dialogue Al-Farabi reports. But for the rest, all of the speeches that are given and that somebody like myself would pay attention to with respect to who said what, why, nothing is said. There's only one person reported on, Aflatun. Okay? Aflatun is the spokesman, so to speak. But the Athenian stranger, or Aflatun, contends that human beings do not grasp, as he puts it, the true political art. And they must seek for the common rather than the private. Even those who do know enough to prefer the common to the private have difficulty resisting the urge to follow their particular good or to subordinate it to the common good. By nature, we seek our own good. The Athenian stranger, Aflatun, does not deny that it's possible, quote, with some divine dispensation for such a human being to come to be who doesn't seek the private good. But it's extremely unlikely. Were it to happen, the simply best thing would be to obey the natural intelligence of such a human being. Since no one like that has yet appeared, it's necessary to rely on the second best, order and law. That's why we follow the laws. We have no first best. We may be political by nature, but we don't know what is best for us politically. Nor are we naturally inclined to do what is best, even when we do learn what it is. I don't have to give you examples. Your daily life is filled with it, and if your daily life is not filled with it, all you have to do is turn on the television. Differently stated, it almost seems as though our nature, or that part of our nature that can be traced to desire, is recalcitrant to what is needed for living in community. But reason shows that it's better for us to live in society. So we have to bend our desires to our reason here, as in so many other matters. So that's the opening point. That's the puzzle that we have. I'd like now to turn to what I call the significance of Plato's book, dialogue, called The Laws. And I'll be ahistorical for a moment and jump ahead to Ibn Sina, who spoke about prophecy and law. Al-Farabi's summary of Plato's laws consists of an introduction, accounts of the first 9 books of Plato's laws, and a conclusion. Let me just point something out to you, which is part of the problem of reading and making sense out of Al-Farabi. As you know, there are 12 books in Plato's laws. As you may know, Book 10 is a discussion about the gods and their relationship to human beings. Accidental that Al-Farabi stops at the end of Book 9? Did he not know anything about it? In the conclusion to the summary, he says the following. We've talked about everything that has come down to us concerning the laws and have tried to make sense out of this. Some people say that there are 10 books to Plato's laws. Others say there are 14. but we've restricted ourselves to these 9. Now, what's the difference between 10 and 14? 12. So he does know what's going on, but chooses not to point to his knowledge of everything. So in the introduction, he explains Plato's art of writing in general, and the method Plato follows in writing the laws in particular. He also sets forth his own method of summarizing Plato's laws. He points to the 2 groups of readers for whom the work was written and indicates the benefit that each might derive from reading it. In other writings, and I'm thinking here of the political regime, the enumeration of the sciences, chapter 5, and the book of religion. In those other writings, Al-Farabi examines the place of legislation and laws in the broader context of political philosophy. Here, the question of laws, as well as how and why they're formulated, becomes the object of a specialized study. Of special importance for Al-Farabi is the relevance of Plato's investigation concerning Greek divine laws for the study and understanding of all divine laws. Indeed, Zeus's role in setting down Greek laws is emphasized at the very beginning of the commentary and reiterated in subsequent passages. Al-Farabi never speaks of Islam or its divine law in the summary, even though he doesn't. No less a successor than Avicenna draws attention to this link in a popular epistle that he wrote entitled On the Division of the Rational Sciences, Risala fi Aqsam al-Ulum al-Aqliya. He, Avicenna, depicts Plato's laws as treating prophecy and the divine law generally, then explains how Arab and Muslim philosophers understand the treatise and the subjects raised in it. Avicenna strives above all to explain what the philosophers mean when they speak of law, the term in question being namus, the Arabic transliteration of the Greek term nomos. Adamant that the philosophers don't use it with a view to deceiving or misleading the people, Avicenna contends that when they speak of law or namus, it's traditional law, sunnah, that they have in mind. And he then goes on from that perspective to infer the following, I quote, "Through this part of practical wisdom, one becomes cognizant of the necessity for prophecy and the need the human species has of law, sharia, for its existence, preservation, and life to come. Through it, through sharia, one becomes cognizant of the wisdom in the universal penalties." And here I'm translating al-hudud al-quliya. Of the universal penalties common to all laws, and in those penalties particular to one law or another, having to do with one people or another and one time or another. And it makes known the difference between divine prophecy and all of the false claims to it. That proclamation has caused any number of people to point to Avicenna and Avicenna's understanding of Plato as the reason to read these laws, Plato's laws and Al-Farabi's commentary. From the philosophical perspective, this is the context for seeking to understand the way Al-Farabi speaks of law in his summary of what he contends Plato had to say about the divine and also the human origin of Greek laws. That is the way he speaks not only of laws, but also of traditional law and of law. Let me restate that in a different way. Not only of laws, nawamis, nomoi, but also of traditional law, sunnah, and of law, capital L, sharia. Okay? In asserting that by namus, philosophers mean sunnah, and then linking the latter with sharia, Avicenna suggests that, at least for them, just forge ahead and make sure you get a place to sit. Yeah. Avicenna asserts that, at least for, I lost my place. For them, law is simply conventional. All law is nomos. Okay? It therefore becomes imperative to investigate what it means to speak of law as coming about through prophecy and revelation. Al-Farabi's skillfulness in presenting all sides of complex issues makes him a most helpful guide in this quest. So, the goal is to understand the intention of the law, its cause. That, rather than how it was given to the person who set it down, is the issue for Al-Farabi. The lawgiver sets down the law. The legislator works out its details and ensures its application as well as the education of the citizens so that they can abide by it. For Al-Farabi, then, one of the most important things is training the citizens to understand the laws and to respect as well as abide by them. Now, what is the goal of the law? For Al-Farabi, simply stated, it's the moral well-being or improvement of the citizens. They must be led to aim at what makes them better. They must be led to aim at human virtue. He is not interested in divine virtue and certainly not in piety. The word piety never occurs. Even though a good end warrants recourse to an evil means for Al-Farabi, it's important to know about the vices and then to avoid them as much as possible. Now, the Athenian stranger makes a great deal about educating the citizens in correct fear or in awe. And if you follow that line of thought, you come close to the whole issue of piety. Not a word from Al-Farabi. Completely silent about this. And here is where our awareness of this other strange figure in the history of philosophy, Musa ibn Maimun, becomes very important. As Al-Farabi has come to be understood in the West, or better put, as Al-Farabi has come to be respected and looked up to in the West, it's in no small part due to the praise heaped on him by Maimonides, who has this great cachet. And so we begin to be interested in Al-Farabi because Maimonides said such good things about him. And Maimonides, in this famous book called The Guide of the Perplexed, speaks about Moses. For him, Moses is the best of the prophets. And Moses brought about a true law, a true Torah, or as one says Torah in Arabic, Sharia. Okay? And the goal is to understand the end of that law. Musa bin Maimun is not interested in having us look up to and revere that Torah or that Sharia, but rather in asking about it. We have to learn how to follow it. That's the goal. And if we know about Musa ben Maimun, we know about him because of a strange man called Leo Strauss. So I'm going to say a couple of things about how Leo Strauss led us to understand both Al-Farabi and these other issues. For Strauss, what happens is Al-Farabi and Maimonides meet Plato's claim head on. Let me quote this one passage. It's a little bit long, but I think it gives you indeed the perspective. The Laws is not a book of whose content one can merely take cognizance without undergoing a change, or which one can merely use for inspiring himself with noble feelings. The Laws contains a teaching which claims to be true, that is, valid for all times. Every serious reader of the Laws has to face this claim. Every Muslim reader in the Middle Ages did face it. He could do this in at least 3 different ways. He could reject Plato's claim by contending that Plato lacked completely the guidance supplied by revelation. He could use the Platonic standards for judging or criticizing specific Islamic institutions, if not for rejecting Islam altogether. Third, he could contend that Islam, and Islam alone, lives up to the true standards set forth by Plato, and on this basis elaborate a purely rational justification of both the content and the origin of Islam. End of quote. I have to admit to you that I've puzzled over this passage for a long, long time. I found it very challenging, daunting, and finally I've come to see the wisdom of what Strauss is pointing at. Indeed, this is a book, both books, both Plato's and Al-Farabi's summary, that force us to take seriously this whole question of law-giving and to think about what that law we inherit or look up to means for us. Now, let me come to some of the more interesting external things. The study of Al-Farabi's summary of Plato's laws has a contentious background. There have been fights about how to study it that go back to the time of Leo Strauss and come up to our day. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but let me tell you about the major contenders and some of the major arguments. First of all, what I would call round one, to keep this in sport terms, boxing terms, if you will. There's the man who first edited the laws on the basis of a single manuscript, Francesco Gabrieli. Okay? And there's Leo Strauss, and there's Mohsen Mahdi. So what happened is Gabrieli edits it, and to show you the difference between what was happening in the 1940s and what is happening in this century, he translated it into Latin, so that everybody could read it, of course. Well, the other thing that he did was he simply tried to point to who must have been the source for Al-Farabi, because Al-Farabi couldn't possibly have thought about these things himself. Leo Strauss came along and wrote a long study how Plato read Farabi's how Farabi read Plato's laws, and pointed out the riches in the book. It is by no means a complete account of the work. Leo Strauss admits that it's just a first attempt to make sense out of it. But he happens to show that the editor simply didn't know what he was doing. Nonplussed, the editor replies and finds it amusing that this German refugee didn't understand how to read Al-Farabi and to do good research in history and find out what the sources were, and dismisses it. So then Strauss comes back with another attempt to explain these things, and I think makes very short shrift of the editor. Afterwards, Mohsen Mahdi, who did study with Strauss, learned a great deal from Strauss, wrote a critique of this first edition of the Editio Princeps, of the summary, using notes from a very famous Oriental scholar, Paul Krauss, who happens to be Leo Strauss's brother-in-law, but who was nonetheless a very gifted scholar. Mahdi pointed out some of the glaring errors in the edition, made suggestions for improving it, and showed how somebody truly steeped in the learning of the tradition that Gabrieli and company wanted to draw on could use that tradition to make sense of the laws, of Al-Farabi's laws. What marks this exchange is utter decorum. Barbs go back and forth, but it's polite. These are gentlemen arguing with one another. And the matter rests quiescent. Then, a number of years later, Thérèse Anne Drouard comes across another manuscript, and Mohsen Mahdi gave to her yet another one that had come his way, so she was able to make a critical edition of the laws and to publish it in a journal in Damascus. This being this part of the world, it languished for 20 years before it was actually published because of all the events that make our lives so interesting. And finally it came to light. But while it was hibernating, so to speak, two scholars asked Drouard if they could use the manuscript because they wanted to write about it. Dimitri Gutas, who's going to come here later in the year, and a man by the name of Joshua Perrins. Gutas, looking at it, decided that it could not possibly be a summary of Plato's laws, that it had to be something else, and the most it could be was a summary of Galen's summary of Plato's laws. He gave a number of very interesting arguments based on reading Greek texts of the laws and pointing out problems with the different manuscripts, but showed a great deal of confusion in the way he handled the different manuscripts and the argument that he was trying to make. And I think it's fair to say, without going into the details, the argument is not convincing. Unfortunately, along the way, he also decided to, wait, let me stop. And then this other fellow, Joshua Perrins, wrote a whole book on the summary. And what Perrins did was taking Gutas' argument apart and showing that there really is no reason to doubt that Al-Farabi had access to something like the laws. He went ahead and tried to make sense of the laws. If he made an error, the error was that he then tried to read from silence an answer. And the way that you can read from silence is if you know that your author has access to the text and purposely passes over it, then it means something. If he doesn't have access to a complete text, then the silence doesn't necessarily mean anything. So there's that flaw in Perrins. The exchange that followed between Gutas and Perrins was anything, let me rephrase it, the attack that Gutas launched upon Perrins was anything but decorous. It was a very nasty exchange. And so decorum went out the window, and now we're back to the way that most scholars operate, fighting from foxholes and throwing stones. Their matters would have remained had it not been for another scholar by the name of Stephen Harvey from Bar Ilan University. And Harvey, having found a manuscript that was somewhat related to the laws from a 10th century Jewish philosopher, not a philosopher, but a scholar, 10th century Jewish scholar, then tried to point out how one could make a bridge between gutus and parents. There the matter remains, and now I enter the fray and simply show you the background, but would like to leave the background aside. I do take as my guiding light that one cannot argue from silence in this text. I'm convinced that Al-Farabi had something like a summary of Plato's laws. We have no way of knowing. Here's the simple story. Al-Farabi had two students who translated the laws. Neither manuscript is available. Okay. Oh, okay, then it must be Galen's. That's not available either. So we don't know. We're arguing from complete ignorance, and what we have to do is to look at what Al-Farabi does and try to make sense of that. Okay. So what we have to do are to note the remarkable insights that Al-Farabi provides to this difficult text. We also have to take note of the unusual manner in which he approaches Plato's laws, just as he explains he will do in the introduction. It's this awareness that has to guide us as we strive to make sense of what he says about law, namus, and the way it comes to be, as well as what that reveals about his understanding and interpretation of what Plato has to say about the same topics. So that's the background. I go on now to trying to make sense of Al-Farabi's summary. As a commentator, Al-Farabi is absolutely delightful. Let me give you some indication of his remarks about Plato. He wants to tell us about what Plato said or how he, about what Plato did or how he spoke. He speaks about his purpose. He says from time to time, this is his intention. Plato spoke at length, effusively, extensively about certain subjects. He mentioned a useful subject. Does that mean that the other ones weren't useful? This is a fair notion, fair in the sense of Hasan, appealing in beauty. He explained a notion that's suited to the discussion at hand, so the other ones weren't. Okay. He rushed on to explain something. He elucidated this notion adequately. And above all, he digressed. Okay. Now, and this is only a short sampling. I have over 25 examples of, over 25 kinds of comments like this that occur in multiple, occur at multiple times. Another thing that Al-Farabi does, which is quite interesting, he identifies the subject of the whole book or treatise at the beginning of all of the treatises except two. Not the first one and not the third one. Why? What's going on? The first one sets the stage for everything that's coming and has some remarkable assertions about laws and law-giving. The third one is quite interesting because it's Al-Farabi's comments on what has to do with deluges, huge floods that wipe away all trace of civilization, and the need to start over again when there are natural catastrophes. So there are numerous occurrences of people starting all over again, to which he gives voice. He passes judgments on things. At one point he speaks of somebody who is a skilled legislator. He identifies a notion to which the legislator, poets, and others who write down what they say ought to pay great attention to. And he deems a notion to be exceedingly useful when it's truly expounded. Now the issue is, who is truly expounding it? Is it Al-Farabi, or had Plato done it? And finally, from time to time, Al-Farabi simply invents a Platonic speech. He says that Plato said something. There's nothing like it. Now, I want to say a few words about the summary itself. He opens his summary of Plato's laws by distinguishing human beings as the species able to determine what is useful and pursue it. They do so, he asserts, by considering how particular incidents point to something more general. It's an observation, then, that privileges inductive reasoning, reflecting about discrete occurrences so as to infer rules of conduct rather than trying to discern the workings of the universe and deduce from that what is good and useful, becomes primarily important. I don't mean to say that in this treatise Al-Farabi jettisons the paradigms set forth in The Political Regime, The Virtuous City, The Attainment of Happiness, The Book of Religion, and similar writings. I don't mean to say that at all. They point to good rulership as centering upon philosophers or kings imbued with philosophic wisdom. Here, Al-Farabi focuses more on political life, actual political life. Consonant with this different emphasis, he draws attention to the solidly human character of lawgivers, even Zeus and Apollo, and the shortcomings of those receiving their laws, and he does this throughout the treatise. He appears especially intent upon identifying the components of a good rather than a best regime. Given Plato's, you could say the Athenian stranger, but as I noted, we're not all that interested in the dialectical character of the dialogue. Given Plato's declaration that the regime aimed at in the laws is a lesser one, perhaps one such as to be achieved, such an objective is not surprising. Nor does such an objective imply a criticism of law-giving generally or of the divinely inspired lawgiver in particular. After all, the Quran itself declares that the Creator purposely established an imperfect political order. You can think of about 5 or 6 verses that point to this. Al-Farabi's indirectness about the quality of the regime envisioned prompts the perspicacious reader to wonder, how does revelation affect law-giving? What distinguishes divinely inspired law-giving from not divinely inspired? And above all, his silence about Islam and the prophetic mission prompts that same line of questioning. So what I think is going on here is that his discussion of the way human beings reason serves to underline Plato's unusual writing style. We shouldn't presume that what Plato does occasionally is what he does always, or even what he does in the laws. The example of the pious ascetic who spoke the truth while pretending to do the opposite and thereby escaped imprisonment, maybe even death, at the hands of an unjust ruler aptly illustrates this point. Let me just tell you the story in brief. It serves as the introduction by Al-Farabi. There's a pious ascetic known for his piety and asceticism. The order goes out to grasp him, seize him, put him in prison. So he dresses up in the costume worn by vagabonds, takes a lute, long handled lute, and goes walking through the streets playing the lute, singing and dancing. Comes to the gates of the city at which point the gatekeeper says, "Who goes there?" He says, "Oh, it is I, the pious ascetic," all the while singing and dancing. And so the gatekeeper becomes angry at this man who's making fun of him, says, "Get out of here," which he does. Okay, so the pious ascetic did not lie in speech, but he did lie in deed. Okay? So this example is illustrative of the point I'm trying to make. And Al-Farabi returns to that example immediately after he said all these things about Plato, and emphasizing that the ability of human beings to distinguish between the useful and the useless in order to arrive at a sense of the good indicates how reasoning moves from the most immediate to the less immediate. That allows him to question indirectly whether the immediate or the more remote is most important. And the lessons to be derived upon reflection, from reflection upon the three topics that he raises here, namely seizing upon the useful as characteristic of human beings, the need for experience, and how more experience makes one more excellent. So thinking about those three, they're given greater salience by the intriguing tale of the ascetic. The point is the need to distinguish clearly, not the need to trick people. Okay? A thoughtful human intent upon wisdom has to be ever alert to what leads to error. In addition to experience, such a learner must discover how to reason correctly about the link between disparate events. The story offers insight as well into how to read the ever-elusive Plato, famously reticent about expressing his opinions in his own voice in the Laws and other dialogues. Plato doesn't appear, except in one dialogue in a passing manner. Okay? Since Plato allowed himself to be known for using symbols and riddles, Al-Farabi is intent on going beyond the tricks or smoke screens to discern the obvious character of the dialogue. And he promises to extract such hints from the Laws as will help both the one who wants to learn more and the one who's not able to study and reflect. That promise affords him an astute way of alluding to the indirect character of his own writing. As he notes in the first treatise of the summary, an adept teacher can use even such apparently useless pastimes as play to instill habits ultimately of use to the one who wants to learn. Now, appealing as it is to consider what can benefit promising citizens or even oneself, that becomes possible only insofar as one excels in applying this faculty by which a human being distinguishes among the causes and objects he deals with and observes. To put that into my own language, one must pay attention to the way things come to be. Just as Plato's Laws opens with the query of whom to credit with laying down the laws by which all cities, and especially old cities, are governed, Al-Farabi's summary notes the importance of determining causality in such matters. For the Athenian stranger who plays such a central role in the Laws, that query quickly gives way to the more important one of what purpose different lawgivers sought to achieve by means of their legislation. And Al-Farabi also moves from the question of who made laws to what purpose they serve. And he passes over in silence that both of those questions are aspects of causality, trying to put forth the idea that only the latter is. Now, this whole approach that I'm suggesting is in many ways inspired by the remarks of Avicenna I referred to earlier. Al-Farabi's summary shows in particular how assiduously he pursues the question posed by Plato's spokesman in this treatise, namely, discovering the best laws for ruling human beings. For Al-Farabi, as for the Athenian stranger, inquiring into whether their origin is divine or human quickly gives way to the more important quest of determining what those laws might be. The laws set down by Zeus and Apollo are as readily denominated shara'i as they are nawamis, laws having something divine as conventional laws. For the names accorded them matter less than identifying what they aim to establish. Indeed, Al-Farabi uses the terms interchangeably in his summary, and he hesitates not the least to term nomos and traditional law, sunnah, divine, ilahi. Okay? Moreover, because achieving clarity about a city that might actually come about necessitates awareness of the laws good for particular human beings living at varied times and places, whereas a general grasp of the ends to be pursued in different kinds of polities suffices for a city that may exist only in speech. The investigation set forth in the summary of Plato's laws is distinct from that of the political regime. That, at least, is intimated in the concluding words of the summary, an account of Al-Farabi's exposition that's worth heeding, even if it's only from the hand of a zealous scribe. Now, let me just say a few words and bring this to an end. Yes. Subordinating law-giving to legislating. Al-Farabi speaks of lawgiver, wadi' al-namus, or wadi' al-nawamis, but never of a lawgiver with a capital L, wadi' al-sharia, or a wadi' al-shari'a. He speaks of a legislator, sahib al-namus, sahib al-nawamis, ashab al-namus, ashab al-nawamis, not of somebody who is a sahib al-sharia. He speaks of, I use the term legist, ahl al-namus, ahl al-nawamis. He speaks of somebody who sets down traditions, wadi' al-sunnah, or wadi' al-sunnan. Speaks of somebody who takes care of traditions, sahib al-sunnah, sahib al-sunnan. He speaks of what I would term an administrator, sa'is. And he speaks of a governor, mudabbir. Okay? But as I've said earlier, he speaks of nothing that has anything to do with the religion that is in common parlance for all of us, and especially for him. Now, with respect to the laws, as I said, the goal, not how they come about. So what are the goals? 1, educate the citizens in moral virtue and in good conduct. Moral virtue and good conduct, not intellectual virtue, justice, or courage. Okay? Upbringing and education for citizenship. By the term upbringing, I'm translating ta'adib. Okay? Adab, and then education, ta'adib. He wants to establish an actual regime, not a city in truth. Laws may pass away due to changes and catastrophes. No body of laws is valid for all peoples and all times. Laws are particular rather than universal. For our days, freedom is praiseworthy, but not essential. Freedom is praiseworthy, but not essential. Throughout the laws, but especially in Book 8, provision for the personal freedom of the citizens is lacking. Everything proposed has the well-being of the city being founded in view. Al-Farabi says almost nothing about this, but he makes no explicit provision for freedom either. The city, for him, takes precedence, and he even says that from time to time, despotic rule is preferable. We don't want to send this book to Egypt. Legislators sometimes find it practical to use stratagems or tricks to persuade the citizens. And I'll close with this point. The good is relative. The major point of Treatise 2 is that laws should be relative to the time, place, and character or nature of those for whom they're intended. In this sense, the good, or more accurately, the path to the good, is relative. Some things are correctly praised at one time and place and for a particular people, but they're blamed at another time and place and for another people. And apart from urging obedience to the gods, Al-Farabi identifies no ultimate good. He asserts there is one, but he doesn't identify it. And the only thing that comes close to that ultimate good is at one point he speaks of whatness, unia, essence, that, and indeedness. I'm sorry, whatness, mahia, essence, that, and what I term indeedness, unia, with respects to the things, and that's the goal. Those are the general contours of this book. And what happens is, these things that I can point to, it's hard to draw from them a simple lesson. I think that's the point. Just as it's hard to draw from the laws, the dialogue, the laws, a general lesson. So thank you very much for your patience. I'm happy to take questions or criticisms. Well, not happy to take criticisms, but I'll try to be happy. Yes, please.
Why should the summary stand alone? Why shouldn't it be, for instance, compared to the other book part? And shouldn't there be some sort of comparison with the other work of Al-Farabi, perhaps Ahl al-Madina al-Fadila? And this would settle some of the intimations there.
The companion to the book, The Virtuous City, the full title being Mabadi Ara Ahl al-Madina al-Fadila, the principles of the opinions of the citizens of the virtuous city. The companion to that is the political regime, okay? Kitab al-Siyasa al-Madaniya, which has a fascinating subtitle, Al-Mulaqab بمبادئ الموجودات, nicknamed or known as principles of the beings. And it so happens that, God willing, when this appears, it will appear with the political regime. So a lot of the references that I was making to the political regime were made for that purpose. And I think what this is an attempt to show that speaking about the king in truth, as he does in the political regime and in Al-Madina al-Fadila, or speaking about that is one path to pursue, and here is another one. This is the more actual path. This is having a city that will actually come about. It's up to you, the reader, to decide which is better, the city in speech or the city that exists. And remember, just to keep this in perspective, Plato wrote two such books. The Republic, in Book 9, after this long account of how to found a best regime, Socrates says, well, I guess this will never come to be. This is a nice series of thoughts that we've put together. Okay? So there's that issue. Yeah. Please, yes.
Just thinking when he stopped at before touching on religion, is it because it's too personal and spiritual? Is it he was afraid of its being that there could be a conflict between different ideas, Sunnis and Sharias and things like that? Or what would you believe could be behind his not touching on this subject?
It's hard to know since he didn't, but he has spoken extensively about religion elsewhere. For Al-Farabi, religion is a similitude of philosophy. Now, what that means is that it's a presentation in popular terms of truth or truths that one arrives at through thinking, all right? And I think that in many respects this is a very dangerous book, and it's even dangerous in our days because it treats things that we revere very cavalierly. I mean, to speak about the way he speaks, the gods of the Greeks do not have to be disrespected. You have to think about what they stand for. And so he's trying to get us to think about what all these issues are. What happens in Book 10 would really be, and he's able to do this by not going all the way, by making suggestions and leaving it to you to think through things. Were he to comment on Book 10, it would have been, I think, a disaster. Okay. I'm not trying to suggest, well, I'm not trying to suggest more than that. I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Even now, religion is a touchy subject.
Well, yesterday, a group of us met here, and we had a very far-reaching discussion about religion. And it started, if I can summarize it quickly, I think it started from trying to explore the difference between what is beyond and what is present, al-ghayb and what is here. We differed, and there were many very explicit differences, but there was no disrespect for either the pursuit of what is ineffable, which cannot be, of what cannot be seen and reasoned about, or of the other. And that's very hard to get at in these days. I mean, at any time, and in these days. I mean, as you know, Al-Farabi had as a practical politician, he leaves a lot to be desired. At one point, he hooked his star to Shams al-Dawla and went off to Damascus and then Aleppo. And then, as today, things turned bad. And he had to flee Aleppo and go to Cairo. And he got to Cairo and things went worse. And so he started back to Damascus and Aleppo. Somewhere along the line, he died. So whatever his wealth of learning is, and however much he helps us think about things, I don't think we want to nominate him to be prime minister or anything like that. Please, yes.
Thank you so much. Wonderful talk. It's interesting, and you invoke Leo Strauss when I saw the title. I thought, well, I wonder if that's a creative trope on his book, Persecution and the Art of War. But no. And then in the course of the talk, you pointed to so many things that he avoids saying. He leaves inside a society, ultimate good, Islam and the Prophet. He never capitalizes lawgiver. He never mentions famine at all. And I wondered if you took Leo Strauss's reading of those different authors in that book, he contends that the silences actually point exactly to what it is. They're so systematic that they point exactly at the point that the philosopher wants to draw on. And I wonder if this is the structure of your argument, or your argument is more tender. You say he's emphasizing the useless and the useful in order to take us to the good, not to the good with a capital G,
Yeah.
the communal good in it.
Yeah.
So I wonder, would you back away then from Leo Strauss's notion that precisely what is systematically left unsaid is the point we should all hear? Whereas I didn't hear you say that, and maybe that you're not saying that.
I'm not going to say that in print. It seems to me that what Strauss was trying to do was to show just how radical the philosophers were, all of the philosophers, and Strauss as a Jew who suffered from the persecution of the Second World War. He ended up in France, then England, and finally the United States, because his homeland was closed to him. But he nonetheless kept trying to push through this idea and came up with the idea that came up with the understanding that even Maimonides, Maimonides, who in Jewish tradition is spoken of as the Rambam, the son of the rabbi, okay, and is revered as a rabbi himself, that even he is more a philosopher than he is a pious Jew. I mean, to that one can only say Allahu Alam. I mean, we don't know, and we, each of us, has to work that out for himself or herself. No question, especially now we have access to Strauss's correspondence, and his correspondence with a very dear friend from university days, Jacob Klein. And the reason I think this is so important is that of the Strauss correspondence, the only person to whom he refers to by his first name and uses uses the familiar term of address. Everybody else is Herr so-and-so and Sie. And when he speaks with Klein, he has horrendous doubts about Maimonides' piety, or he has great doubts about Maimonides' piety, which may tell you something about Strauss's own stance. Yes, please.
Sorry, just two quick questions, if I may, with maybe clarifications. The first one concerns what you clearly stated the anecdote of the pious ascetic, right? And in some sense, what I'm getting, I don't know if I picked up properly on the signal, but in some sense you're suggesting that Al-Farabi himself is playing that game through his commentary on the laws of Plato, where he seems, does he want to lie indeed but say something in truth in this text?
Yes.
Beyond simply saying, well, this is what Plato says. This is actually what Al-Farabi says.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
This is why you mentioned his sort of, making up certain Platonic dialogues or certain references. And kind of commenting in such a way to sort of suggest that this is occurring, well, coming out of the mouth of the stranger, that king is stranger, but in fact it's not the stranger at all, is it? It's Al-Farabi himself. Which does kind of lead me to the second point, if I may, since I seem to have gotten this point. More than once you kind of focus on how he goes to the final cause of the laws rather than their source, right? What is their purpose? And you kind of say, well, how is this? That he just wants to ignore the beginnings. But is it so much ignored as much as it actually fits very well within his kind of overall emanationist kind of approach, which you do see in Mabadi al-Nabil al-Fadila, right? I mean, he's not so much interested even there in an efficient kind of causality, if I may use these terms, but rather precisely in the very fact that coming together and living within a social context, governed in a certain manner, is precisely for the fulfillment of our humanity, right? And that's the only thing that seems to matter for
this whole business of Al-Farabi and his emanationist explanation. It also occurs, by the way, in the political regime. Okay. Does that make sense? Is that the way to explain the origin of things and ongoing causality? I cannot make sense out of it. I have great doubts. In an unguarded moment, I was recently at a conference in Spain with a group of observant Catholics, people from a philosophy department, but much more interested in metaphysics than other aspects of philosophy. And in passing, I said, well, this sounds to me like a joke. After I picked myself up off the floor, kicks being aimed at me, I thought, well, gee, maybe I have to treat these things with a little bit more respect. And I realized that okay, what is meant by it? It does not make sense, but what is meant by it, and what is he trying to say? I think in many respects, what we come up against is this is something we cannot explain, all right? Now, carrying on the Farabian tradition, Ibn Rushd, okay, in response to the criticism of Farabi and Ibn Sina by Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd Averroes tries to justify philosophy before the tribunal of the revealed law, before the tribunal of Sharia. And he says something that really must give all of us pause. There are three things, evidence for which exists abundantly and therefore cannot be denied. The existence of the Creator, Baria is the term he uses, the existence of prophetic missions, and happiness or punishment in the life to come. Wow, that's a big plate to swallow, okay? And then, as Averroes goes on, having made this assertion, as he goes on, you then have to try to figure out, well, rationally, how do I account for that? I think nobody who's philosophically inclined has any difficulty with the first two, okay? The third one's a big one, okay? And as a matter of fact, in his reply to Al-Ghazali, Al-Ghazali did something very tender in the very last chapter of his Tahafut al-Falasifa. He accuses the philosophers of kufr, okay, and of unbelief, and therefore deserving all the punishment that comes with that accusation. Not one to let pass the compliment. Averroes, in the last chapter of his Tahafut al-Tahafut, okay, explains what is meant among the philosophers by happiness and punishment in the life to come. It's an interpretation. It's an interpretation. Well, yeah, I mean, some things cannot be taken literally. And the one thing we know from Averroes is that we have to approach the text, in this case the Quran, and learn how to read it, interpret it from time to time. Some things cannot be, should not be, ought not be interpreted. Others need to be interpreted. So I think there's that issue going on. Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for a most insightful lecture. I was wondering whether there's, I mean, you mentioned that Al-Farabi sees there's certain laws are suitable, there's like the good is relative, and laws are suitable to a particular time and place, particular people. Is there a notion at all of progress in these, or of relationships between these various situations, or is it simply pointillistic or impressionistic kind of
No,
that's my
no. Not progress in the sense that we today accept so blithely, no, through time. No, no. And indeed, if you're going to speak in a thoughtful way as a member of a religious community, there can't be progress.
No.
You know, I mean, there was a good time, and that good time fell. Now it can be, you know, you can depending on your community, you can interpret what that good time was in a number of different ways. But so no progress, and the more, but really the issue then is, what might be, if not the best regime, a good regime, and how is that to be attained? One of the great pleasures of being allowed to teach or to live as a teacher in an academic community is that you get to read books more than once. And sometimes they become good friends. And like any good friend, the more you see that friend, the more you understand it. So I've been reading this book for I don't know how many times, called Kitab Tanbih al-Sabil al-Sa'ada, the book of introduction to the path to happiness. And the other day, a light turned on. Al-Farabi speaks in this book of the Sabil, of the path to happiness. And he actually defines what it is. In every other reading that I've looked at of Al-Farabi, he keeps pointing, you know, this is the author, after all, of the book called Tahsil al-Sa'ada, okay, the attainment of happiness. I defy you to tell me what happiness is after you've read that book. All right? It's just not there. So, the Sabil is philosophy. Why? Because it allows a person who pursues it to perceive correctly the truth and distinguish it from untruth, al-haq, and to distinguish it from untruth with certainty. My goodness, okay? I mean, that's an incredible assertion, all right? And so then what that means, I think, is that happiness is following the path. It's not grasped and attained once and for all. And, you know, think about images. Let's think about Quranic images, about what heaven is supposed to be. Okay? It's a kind of delight that one has in doing the normal things that we do as human beings, but doing it without any of the after effects that we normally have as human beings. Contemplation? Okay. That's just a tentative guess, but I mean that's where I see things going. We have to keep looking for that good regime, and probably the king in truth, al-Malik fil haqiqa, is like Socrates' city in speech. Okay? It's something to point to, but it's nothing, it's nobody we're going to see. I can assure you, to be practical for a moment, that it is not General El-Sisi. Okay? There are things that we know clearly are not the case. I couldn't resist that. Okay. Yes.
About there is a text which is somehow concordant in harmony with what you said. It is a Didascalia in rhetorical Aristotelica, which is Farabi's text on rhetoric, which is preserved only in Latin but not in Arabic. But in this text, he deals with laws. He deals with general laws and particular laws, not philosophical laws, general laws and particular laws. And of course, then he didn't link laws to the perfect good, to the absolute good, and so. Nevertheless, he speaks about Muslim law there. He speaks about which he says is a particular kind of particular laws, and they give examples of Muslim law. So here, of course, as you said, there is a text, as in the laws, he speaks about laws without linking them to the absolute law, and in this sense, this text is supports your argument. But on another side, you spoke about the Tahsil al-Sa'ada. In the Tahsil al-Sa'ada, there is a very profound reflection about the relation. I cannot go into detail, but about the relation between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge. And practical knowledge is to bring about universal laws in our societies. That means to singularize, to give some singularity to these universal laws. And if we read very closely the Tahsil al-Sa'ada, we see that the practical realization is on the level of not universal laws, but general laws. There is, for example, there is some laws about leading armies, which is general for our modern society, which has tanks, and which are not available for the Greek society who didn't have tanks. This is general laws, but not universal laws. And the Tahsil al-Sa'ada is a reflection on the relation between these universal laws and the general laws, proper to some nation, to some periods. And in these general laws, if you look very closely to the vocabulary, comes the particular laws, or the laws proper to the good, the limited good you spoke, the khataba, the rhetoric, which is the exposition of these particular laws to common people, and the war. Because war is a kind of doing, applying, of realizing practically universal laws. So, waging war again.
Oh, okay, again. Okay.
The text is in. I know Paris has another interpretation, but I don't. So, in sum, what I wanted to say, there is text, of course, who, as you said, didn't spoke about laws without linking them to universal absolute good, but that doesn't mean that Farabi hasn't a theoretical, doctrinal place in his work in which he reflected about the links between the universal laws, which are of the level of the good, and these laws which are more practical and possible. And I don't agree absolutely when you said that there is no knowledge of theoretical things by Farabi. You mean, of course, you are perhaps right about God. There is no real theory of God. But there is theoretical things which are Farabi things are no. For example, the definition of courage, the general definition that is in the ethics, the Nicomachean ethics, the definition of courage is universal. Now, the role of the particular laws and the khataba and war is to apply this general, very general, very vague definition in concrete situations. So I think that the gap is not so big as I thought you are telling us. Perhaps I didn't understand you very well.
No, I think that's very important. The problem that I have with the attainment of happiness, Tahsil al-Sa'ada, is that this is also the text in which he says that the idea of the king, the philosopher, the ruler, the prophet is one. I'm thinking, what does that mean? Well, the only way that makes sense is that all of them have seized the truth and can apply it. Now, I don't think that he's ever showed that. You know, that's, and for me, this is the same thing as this al-Malik fil Haqiqa. It's a very appealing idea, one to which we want to look, but it ends up being a city in speech. You know, it ends up being a pie in the sky.
They understand at least the Nicomachean ethics.
No, that's easy. I have an easy.
The knowledge is not only the knowledge of God, it is only also the knowledge of these general ethical rules, which are the Nicomachean, which are the general rules of the Nicomachean ethics are not practical rules. If you look, they are the universal rules. They are theoretical rules. The general rules applying these universal rules are practical.
Yes.
I don't know if
and what is the general rule for all of the moral virtues?
For?
All of the moral virtues.
I didn't, but can you say it in French?
Quelle est la règle générale ou la définition générale pour toutes les vertus morales? Pour chaque vertu morale.
C'est une certaine médiété dans l'action. It's very big. But you have to apply it in every concrete way.
Oh yeah, no. But you know, that's the mean, not in excess, not in deficiency. And just as it differs with food, you know, what I eat versus what a wrestler eats is different. Okay, so my courage has to be of a lesser order than one of these warriors that we send out. Okay.
In each situation,
you know, my liberality as a spender is a lot different from that of a Saudi monarch. Okay.
That's the practical application of the general.
Yeah. No, and the general rule is this mean. Yeah. All good things should come to an end. That's a general rule. Thank you very much for. It's good to see you.